Hey dudes, tonight we're digging into something pretty wild. The forgotten foods that were actually served at George Washington's dinner table. Yeah, you heard that right. The man who led a revolution was also dealing with some seriously strange meals that you wouldn't believe were once considered fine dining. We're talking about dishes that would totally throw off your idea of what it meant to eat like a founding father. But before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe, only if you're seriously vibing with what I'm putting out. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always dope to see how far this journey is going. Now turn down the lights, and if you've got someone by your side, give him a hug. If you're rolling solo, don't sweat it, I'm single too. Let's kick back and take a trip into the past, where the meals were as weird as they were revolutionary. In the year 1347, the world was about to be irrevocably changed by an invisible enemy. For centuries, death had been a constant companion, with famines, wars, and local epidemics claiming lives in every corner of the globe. Yet nothing would compare to the devastation that came with the Black Death, a pandemic that would sweep through Europe, Asia, and North Africa with terrifying speed. The Black Death was not a single disease, but rather a term that would later describe a series of deadly outbreaks, with the most lethal being the bubonic plague. It spread rapidly, with some areas seeing death rates as high as 60 to 70%. To the people of the medieval world, this was not just a tragedy. It was an apocalypse, a sign of the end times. With no understanding of disease transmission, they believed it to be divine punishment or the work of demons. In fact, many survivors would later attest that the terror of the plague itself was worse than the death it brought. For the majority of survivors, their daily lives before the plague had already been full of hardship. Life in medieval Europe was harsh, with many people living in small, overcrowded homes made of wood, clay, and thatch. Sanitation was poor. Waste was often discarded in the streets, and animals shared living quarters with humans. This meant that diseases, such as cholera, dysentery, and the flu, were ever present, and people had grown accustomed to the fact that illness was a part of life. But the Black Death was a new breed of horror. It didn't just affect the poor or the weak. It claimed anyone from beggars to kings without discrimination. When the plague struck, it did so with terrifying swiftness. Infected individuals often experienced flu-like symptoms, which quickly escalated into high fever, swollen lymph nodes, and eventually, painful buboes that oozed pus. Infected people died within days, sometimes within hours, leaving entire families devastated. With no way of knowing who would survive or who would succumb to the disease, the medieval world became a place of unimaginable fear. Cities were abandoned, villages were wiped out, and even entire towns were left to rot. As the disease spread, medieval society struggled to maintain any sense of normalcy. Markets were deserted, homes were left unoccupied, and fields went untended. The survivors were faced with a desolate world where everything they had known was falling apart. Their survival wasn't just about avoiding the plague. It was about navigating a world where every corner was filled with the stench of death, and every encounter was fraught with risk. In some areas, panic took over. People fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the reach of the disease, but the plague found them there too. Others turned to religious explanations, seeing the plague as a punishment from God. Flagellants, groups of people who would whip themselves in penance, traveled from town to town in an attempt to appease the wrath of God. However, despite their desperate efforts, the plague showed no mercy. It was not just the physical toll of the plague that made survival so difficult. It was the emotional and psychological burden. Every survivor had witnessed the death of their loved ones, and in many cases, had to bury them without the support of others. The trauma of losing entire families, often with no chance to say goodbye, would leave scars that lasted far beyond the pandemic itself. But for some, survival meant adapting to an unrecognizable world. Those who remained had to learn how to live with the constant threat of the plague hanging over their heads. Their world had changed, and they had to change with it, but how did they manage to rebuild? What strategies did they use to cope with the aftermath of the pandemic, when the very fabric of society seemed to be in tatters? Aftermath: surviving the destruction. The Black Death left behind a world that was unrecognizable. When the initial wave of the plague finally began to subside, it was clear that things would never be the same. Nearly half of Europe's population had perished, leaving empty cities, devastated towns, and a severe shortage of labor. This was a world where survivors found themselves not only coping with the loss of their loved ones, but also navigating a transformed landscape where survival meant adapting to entirely new circumstances. In the immediate aftermath, the survivors faced immense challenges. The sudden and widespread loss of life meant that there were fewer hands to till the soil, fewer craftsmen to repair homes, and fewer traders to keep the economy flowing. The agricultural sector, which had been the backbone of medieval society, struggled to recover. Many fields went untended, and even the animals were left to fend for themselves. In some places, it took years for the land to be fully productive again, as crops failed and famine loomed on the horizon. One of the first adaptations that survivors had to make was a shift in their daily routines. With fewer people around to help rebuild, the survivors were forced to take on multiple roles. Women, in particular, found themselves taking on more responsibility, stepping in to manage farms, run businesses, and raise children without the support of husbands, fathers, or brothers. Some women were even forced to marry quickly, often out of necessity rather than choice, to ensure the survival of their families. For the survivors, survival was a matter of improvisation and reinvention. Trade routes that once brought goods from distant lands had broken down, and the global network of commerce had fallen apart. In many places, local economies sprang up as the survivors turned to barter and self-sufficiency. With so few people left to do the work of the economy, those who remained found themselves in a position of power. Wages increased, and for the first time in centuries, peasants found themselves in a position to demand better pay for their labor. However, this shift in power was not without its conflicts. As the plague had decimated the lower classes, it had also decimated the nobility. With many aristocrats dead, their estates were left in disarray, and new leaders emerged to take their place. Some landowners turned on their surviving peasants, attempting to seize back power through violence or exploitation. The feudal system, which had dominated Europe for centuries, began to crumble under the pressure of the plague's aftermath. But the survivors had little choice but to endure and adapt. Religious institutions, too, found themselves struggling. The church had lost many of its clergy, and the remaining priests and monks were often overwhelmed by the sheer volume of funerals they had to conduct. For many survivors, the question of faith became more complicated. While some turned to religion for solace, others began to question the authority of the church. Why had God allowed such devastation? Was the church truly a place of refuge and safety? Or was it just another institution that had failed to protect them in their hour of need? For many, the emotional and psychological toll of surviving the plague was just as damaging as the physical. Survivors often found themselves living in a state of perpetual fear, with the shadow of the plague hanging over them like a specter. Every cough, every fever, every sign of sickness became a source of dread. The trauma of having lost so many loved ones was compounded by the constant anxiety of potentially becoming infected again. Even when the immediate threat of the plague subsided, the survivors were left to cope with the long-term effects of living through a global catastrophe. But despite all these challenges, the survivors found ways to endure. They rebuilt their homes, replanted their fields, and re-established trade. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Black Death was different, but it was still a world worth living in. New ideas began to emerge as people looked for ways to avoid future pandemics. Quarantine measures were introduced in some places, and medical practices began to evolve, albeit slowly. However, there was no returning to the past. The survivors were forced to carve out a new future for themselves, a future shaped by the lessons of the past, but defined by their own resilience. In some ways, the world that emerged from the plague was a world of opportunity for the survivors. The shortage of labor meant that the economy began to favor the worker over the landowner. The long-term effects of the Black Death would shift the balance of power in Europe, setting the stage for the social and political changes that would later define the Renaissance. But at what cost? How much would the survivors of the Black Death have to endure before they could truly say they had emerged from the disaster? Lingering shadows, long-term effects on society. The survivors of the Black Death lived in a world transformed. The pandemic that had wiped out roughly half of Europe's population did not merely alter the landscape physically. It also left indelible marks on the psyche of society. While the immediate devastation was felt in terms of lost lives and economic collapse, the true long-term effects of the Black Death would be far-reaching, shaping everything from social structures to cultural attitudes. One of the most significant and enduring impacts was the profound shift in labor dynamics. With a massive portion of the population gone, the demand for labor skyrocketed. The survivors, many of whom had been peasants and lower-class workers before the plague, now found themselves in an unprecedented position of power. The labor shortage gave rise to higher wages and better working conditions. But this newfound leverage also brought with it tensions between the surviving workers and the landowners who had once held all the power. For centuries, the feudal system had defined the relationships between lords and serfs, with peasants bound to the land they worked, often living in poverty. But the Black Death upended this order. As workers became scarcer, landowners were forced to negotiate better terms to retain laborers. While some peasants benefited from higher wages and improved living standards, others faced growing resentment from the aristocracy. In some regions, attempts to maintain the old feudal system led to violent uprisings, such as the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. The changing economic landscape also had cultural ramifications. The rise of a more independent and self-sufficient labor force sparked a shift in attitudes toward work, money, and power. For the first time, the working classes had some degree of control over their lives, which in turn contributed to a gradual erosion of the rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval Europe. The effects of this shift would ripple through society for centuries, laying the groundwork for the eventual rise of the modern capitalist economy. But while the economic landscape was changing, the psychological and emotional toll of surviving the plague was equally profound. For the survivors, the trauma of the pandemic lingered long after the last victim had been buried. The loss of so many loved ones, often without the opportunity for proper farewells, left deep scars. For those who had witnessed the bodies of family members, friends, and neighbors piled up in the streets, the world became a much darker place. The Black Death also brought about a shift in religious thought. In a society where religion had been the cornerstone of everyday life, the plague's devastating toll led many to question the role of God and the Church. Why had the Almighty allowed such suffering? Was this divine punishment, or had the Church itself failed to protect its followers? Some turned to new religious movements, while others rejected the Church altogether, leading to the rise of more radical, heterodox beliefs. The Church's inability to prevent the plague, or to offer any meaningful answers to the suffering it caused, shook its authority, though it would take centuries before the full effects of this religious disillusionment were realized. For some, the psychological scars of the plague were not just an abstract experience, but became part of their physical reality. The constant threat of disease, the horror of watching loved ones perish, and the fear of future outbreaks left survivors in a constant state of anxiety. The long-term effects on mental health were far-reaching, with many survivors experiencing a form of collective trauma. Communities had to rebuild not just their homes and economies, but their very sense of self and security. But amidst all this suffering, something remarkable happened. The survivors began to rebuild their world. Cities that had been abandoned began to attract new settlers. Trade slowly resumed, and over time, Europe began to recover from the devastation. The shortage of labor led to an increase in wages, and those who had once been bound to the land now had the opportunity to move freely and seek out new opportunities. The Black Death, in its terrible way, created a society where social mobility was possible in a way that it had never been before. However, even as the survivors began to rebuild, the shadow of the plague hung over them. It became a part of their collective memory, an event that had altered the course of history. The Black Death's legacy would shape the cultural, economic, and social structures of Europe for generations. The scars of the past would be visible for years, but they also marked the beginning of a new era. For all the destruction it caused, the Black Death was also a catalyst for change, bringing with it the seeds of transformation that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the modern world. The plague had torn through Europe like a storm, leaving a society in tatters. But out of the ashes, the survivors slowly began to rebuild, adapting to the new world they found themselves in. What had once seemed like an insurmountable disaster had become a pivotal moment in history, reshaping not only the course of Europe, but the way humans thought about death, life, and the future. The rat's role in history. Section 1. How fleas and rats spread the plague. In the wake of the Black Death, much of the focus was placed on the tragic loss of life, the collapse of economies, and the psychological trauma of the survivors. But behind the scenes, one of the most important and often overlooked players in the plague spread was the humble rat. It is difficult to imagine that these small, unassuming creatures could have such a profound impact on history, yet they played a key role in the deadly spread of the Black Death across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The connection between rats, fleas, and the plague was not understood at the time, but the mechanics of how the disease spread were simple yet terrifyingly effective. The Yersinia pestis bacteria, which causes the bubonic plague, was carried by fleas that infested rats. Rats themselves were common in medieval Europe, living in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of cities and towns. Their presence was so ubiquitous that few paid much attention to them. But what made these rats especially dangerous were the fleas that fed on their blood. Infected fleas would bite a human, transmitting the bacteria that would eventually cause the devastating symptoms of the plague. The rats were not just carriers, they were also complicit in spreading the disease. As Europe's population grew and cities became more densely packed, the conditions were ideal for rats to thrive. Many people lived in close quarters with their animals, and the rats found ample food and shelter in the filth and waste that collected in the streets. As the plague spread across Europe, the rats moved with it, often being carried from port to port aboard ships. These ships, trading goods between Asia and Europe, became critical vectors for the disease's spread. In the early days of the plague, it was unclear how the disease was spreading. People noticed the sudden deaths and the frighteningly fast progression of the illness, but they had no understanding of how or why it was happening. As victims were struck down by fever and painful buboes, cities quickly descended into chaos. Some believed the plague was sent by God as a punishment for sin, while others thought it was a result of contaminated air or bad vapors. In fact, the true cause of the plague was the Yersinia pestis bacterium, but at the time, people had no way of understanding the role of the fleas and rats in spreading the disease. It wasn't until centuries later that scientists uncovered the truth. Even though the rats themselves didn't show the same symptoms as the humans they infected, their role in spreading the disease was crucial, and it is now believed that they were the silent agents of the plague's rapid spread. As ships laden with infected rats docked in European ports, the disease quickly spread along established trade routes. From the Mediterranean to the heart of Europe, the rats carried the plague from one town to the next, and then on to villages and cities. Every infected rat was a potential vector, and every flea that jumped to a human was a potential death sentence. How did people live under such constant threat? Was there any escape from the unseen enemy that lurked at the edges of every village, city, and port? The rat, often considered nothing more than a nuisance, was in fact the silent agent of death, and for the survivors, the world became a place where even the smallest creatures could be lethal. The Great Migration of Rats across Europe. The year was 1347, and Europe had already begun to feel the tremors of an invisible storm, one that would bring with it an unprecedented level of devastation. The Black Death had begun to sweep across Europe, but its arrival was anything but sudden. As the rats carrying infected fleas traveled across the continent, their migrations played a significant role in ensuring the rapid spread of the plague. By the time the disease arrived in Europe, it had already devastated parts of Asia. From the Chinese port of Canton, the disease spread westward through the Silk Road trade routes, carried by both humans and rats. The journey was long, but the rats, who thrived in the dark recesses of merchant ships, helped hasten the arrival of the disease in Europe. In 1347, the plague reached the Italian port city of Messina, where it began to spread with terrifying speed. The arrival of the disease was accompanied by stories of entire towns falling silent, the dead left unburied, and families wiped out within days. The port cities of Europe, with their bustling trade and constant traffic of goods from across the globe, became ground zero for the plague's entry into Europe. These cities, already known for their filth and overcrowding, were perfect breeding grounds for rats, who found food scraps, waste, and shelter in every corner. The rats, along with the fleas carrying Yersinia pestis, were not limited to just one city or country. They migrated along with the growing tide of disease. As ships made their way across the Mediterranean and the coasts of Europe, rats infested new lands, brought on by the transport of goods and the human migrations caused by the plague. These rodents and their fleas rode along on the same trade routes that had long been the lifeblood of Europe's economy. But now, those same routes became conduits for death. Within a few months, the plague had spread from Messina to Sicily, and soon to the mainland of Italy. It moved swiftly through France, Spain, and England, following the same path as the rats. Trade routes that had once been the foundation of Europe's prosperity were now the highways of death, as infected rats scurried across the continent, bringing disease to every port, every city, and every town they reached. The Black Death had no boundaries, and no corner of Europe was left untouched. For the people living in the path of the plague, survival became a matter of luck and strategy. In some areas, people tried to flee to the countryside, hopping to escape the cities and the threat of the plague. But the rats were already there, and with them, the fleas. Even the most isolated villages were not safe. It was as if the world itself had become infected with fear, with every rat carrying a death sentence. The rats' migration didn't stop at the shores of Europe. They carried the plague northward, reaching the Scandinavian countries and even the more remote regions of Eastern Europe. Wherever they went, the disease followed. The once pristine countryside became infected as the rats found their way into rural villages, where they spread the plague to the few remaining populations that had yet to be affected. In addition to spreading the disease, the rats' constant movement through cities and towns left a trail of destruction. As trade halted and ports were abandoned, the economies of entire regions ground to a halt. The survivors were left to contend with not only the disease itself, but also the economic collapse that followed in its wake. The reality for those who remained was one of constant vigilance. As rats continued to spread, the fear of being infected lingered in every corner. Survivors found themselves not only avoiding contact with the sick, but also becoming increasingly hostile toward anyone they suspected might be carrying the disease, whether human or animal. Was it possible to live in a world so thoroughly infected? What were the survivors to do when the rats had already scurried into every part of their lives? A look at the ecological impact post-plague. By the time the Black Death had run its course through Europe, leaving devastation in its wake, it had fundamentally altered not only the human population but also the natural environment. The rats, which had long been seen as nothing more than pests, had inadvertently shaped the course of history through their role in spreading the plague. Yet, when the plague subsided, their legacy didn't end there. In the aftermath of the pandemic, the ecological landscape of Europe changed in profound ways. With the dramatic reduction in the human population, the pressure on the land lessened. The survivors, those who had been spared the horrors of the disease, found themselves inheriting a world that had been cleared of much of its human activity. This shift allowed nature to begin reclaiming spaces that had once been dominated by bustling towns, farms, and villages. In cities, the absence of human activity allowed rat populations to stabilize and flourish. Without as many people to scavenge food from, the rats were now free to roam, but their behavior began to change. Instead of living exclusively in the dark corners of human settlements, they expanded into open fields, forests, and even isolated rural villages, feeding on crops that had been abandoned and growing wild. The rats, now more abundant than ever, continued to thrive in a new post-plague world. In rural areas, the reduction in human activity allowed forests to reclaim fields that had once been cleared for agriculture. With fewer people to tend to the land, weeds and wild plants began to overtake farmsteads. The open land once cultivated for crops now became fertile ground for wildlife, and the land's ecosystem slowly began to recover from the human-driven pressures that had dominated for centuries. However, this ecological recovery was not without its own set of challenges. As forests expanded and vegetation grew unchecked, it became a more favorable environment for the rats, who found abundant food sources in the now wild fields. But the rats were not the only creatures to benefit. In the absence of human intervention, the number of other animals such as deer, wild boar, and various small mammals grew as well. The forests began to regrow, and for the first time in centuries, parts of Europe that had been cleared for farming began to return to their natural state. On the other hand, the plague also left its scars on the land. The human abandonment of towns and villages meant that many areas were left in disarray, with homes, farms, and crops left untended. These abandoned spaces were gradually overtaken by nature, but the transition from a world of industry to one of wilderness was not without cost. While wildlife flourished in the absence of humans, some of the former agricultural lands never recovered, and entire regions saw a decline in human-driven agricultural productivity. The long-term ecological effects of the Black Death were felt well beyond the rat populations. As rats carried the plague from port to port, from city to city, they had also indirectly caused shifts in the global environment. The decline in human populations had impacted not only Europe, but also the trade networks that linked the continents. The severance of these connections, while temporary, allowed for a brief moment of ecological reset. Some species that had been previously threatened by human expansion found a moment of respite. However, this return to nature was bittersweet for the survivors, who now found themselves rebuilding their homes and livelihoods in an altered landscape. Yet the rats' role in history was far from over. As Europe gradually recovered from the plague, rats would continue to play their part, not as agents of death, but as survivors of their own ecological shift. It was in the aftermath of the Black Death that the rats began to be understood differently. No longer seen solely as a nuisance, they were now recognized as symbols of survival and persistence. Whether it was in their continued migration across continents, their role in maintaining ecological balance, or even in their ongoing spread of disease. The rats had, in essence, become agents of the unexpected consequences of the Black Death. In their wake, they left behind a world that was both a cleaner, quieter place, but also a world in which the balance of power had shifted. Those who had survived the plague now had to contend with not just the devastation of human loss, but also a natural world that had begun to adjust itself, in part because of the destruction wrought by the rats. As for the survivors, they had a new world to rebuild, one where nature had taken a foothold, and humanity had to learn to coexist with the creatures who had indirectly shaped the course of history. How would this changed landscape shape the future of Europe? Would the survivors find a way to adapt to this new world, Or would the lessons of the Black Death continue to echo through history? The medieval responses to the plague. From prayer to witch hunts, how people reacted. When the Black Death began to spread across Europe, the reaction of the people varied, influenced by religious beliefs, superstition, and the sheer chaos that the plague brought to their lives. In a society where faith was central to daily life, many turned to religion as a means of coping with the horror. But religion was not the only answer people sought. Desperation gave rise to a range of responses, some of which were grounded in fear, while others were rooted in long-standing superstitions. In the early days of the plague's outbreak, the prevailing explanation was divine wrath. The Church had long taught that suffering on earth was a punishment for sin, and so many believed that the Black Death was God's punishment for the wickedness of humanity. As the death toll mounted, communities prayed fervently, seeking divine intervention. Processions were held, and mass penitence rituals were organized, where people begged for forgiveness in hopes of averting further destruction. Some took extreme measures in their pursuit of salvation. The most famous example of such religious responses was the rise of the Flagellants, a group of zealots who believed that self-inflicted suffering was a way to appease God's wrath. These groups traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with scourges, hoping that by punishing themselves, they could remove the sin from the world and stop the plague. Their belief in the power of self-flagellation to ward off the disease was fervent, but ultimately it proved ineffective. The plague raged on despite their efforts. As religious explanations failed to provide any relief, new, more radical theories began to gain traction. Some people turned to astrology and mysticism, seeking answers from the stars or consulting so-called wise women who were believed to possess occult knowledge. Others looked for scapegoats to blame. In a time of fear and uncertainty, it was easy for suspicions to grow, and soon, communities began to target those they believed to be the cause of the plague. One of the most horrific responses to the Black Death was the witch hunts that swept across Europe. A surge of anti-Semitic sentiment took hold, with Jewish communities being blamed for poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the disease. Jews were accused of conspiring to bring about the end of the world, and many were tortured and burned at the stake in horrific public executions. Entire Jewish communities were decimated, their members either killed or driven into exile. The Church, though it did not officially condone such violence, was often complicit in the witch hunts, encouraging the public to root out heretics, Jews, and others who were seen as enemies of the Church. The response to the plague reflected a deepening division between reason and superstition, with people turning to whatever explanations offered them the slightest hope of survival. The witch hunts and mass executions were a testament to the breakdown of order and reason in the face of such a catastrophic event. But these violent responses also served as a reflection of the medieval mindset. When confronted with a disaster of such scale and unknown origin, people struggled to make sense of the chaos. In the absence of scientific understanding, superstition and fear ruled the day, and innocent people suffered as a result. How could people, faced with the terrifying unknown, find rational explanations for what was happening? And what does this reveal about human nature when faced with crisis? Do we, too, look for scapegoats or cling to what we know, even when it fails us? These were questions that medieval Europe grappled with, and their responses to the plague are a haunting reminder of the ways in which fear and uncertainty can shape societal behavior. Quarantines, fleeing, and the collapse of trade. As the Black Death continued its relentless sweep across Europe, the survival strategies of medieval societies evolved, though not always in the ways one might expect. In the wake of the early religious responses, some cities began to introduce measures aimed at controlling the spread of the disease. Quarantine, a concept that would become more widely known in the centuries to come, was among the first steps taken in an attempt to curb the infection. In 1377, the city of Dubrovnik, now in Croatia, enacted one of the first known quarantine laws in Europe. Ships arriving from plague-infected areas were forced to anchor in the harbor for a period of 40 days, later known as the quarantina, from which we get the word quarantine. The passengers and crew were isolated, preventing any potential infected individuals from entering the city. While this measure was groundbreaking, it was hardly foolproof. The disease still spread rapidly, as many travelers, desperate to flee infected areas, ignored or circumvented such regulations. Fleeing to the countryside or to other cities was a common strategy for those who could afford it. The wealthy, who had the resources to escape, often retreated to their country estates or remote areas in an effort to avoid the plague. However, this flight from cities was not always effective, as rats and fleas accompanied them. The countryside, once considered a safe haven, soon became just as infected as the towns, as the rats found new places to live, feed, and spread disease. The collapse of trade and the breakdown of long-established routes were among the immediate and long-term consequences of the plague. In a world that relied on the movement of goods, spices, textiles, salt, grain across borders, the plague brought trade to a halt. Ships, which had once carried precious cargoes between Europe, Africa, and Asia, now carried the disease instead. Markets were abandoned and production ground to a halt as workers died or fled. Even when survivors returned to cities, the absence of goods and supplies crippled economies that had once thrived on international trade. The collapse of commerce left many communities in turmoil. In Italy, for instance, Venice, a city that had once been the hub of Mediterranean trade, saw its markets stall, as merchants were either dead or too afraid to conduct business. Similar declines in economic activity occurred in Florence, Milan, and other Italian city-states that had been central to European trade networks. The plague not only killed vast numbers of people, but also effectively erased the flow of wealth that had sustained many parts of Europe. The stagnation of trade also led to a dramatic shift in the economic relationships between different social classes. Without the large number of laborers to work the fields and tend to industries, the remaining workers were in a much stronger bargaining position. The sudden scarcity of workers allowed peasants and artisans to demand higher wages, which led to inflation and increased costs for the wealthy. Landlords, already facing the death of many of their tenants, found themselves without the manpower to manage their estates. But despite the initial collapse of trade and the economic slowdown, the long-term consequences would lead to some unexpected outcomes. The rise in wages and the decline of feudal labor meant that there were fewer people bound to the land. As more individuals became free to work where they pleased, society began to shift. Over the coming decades, this economic reordering would play a crucial role in the decline of feudalism and the rise of a new economic order that would eventually set the stage for the Renaissance. In some regions, however, the fear of contagion continued to dictate policy and behavior. Cities like Florence and Milan, still reeling from the effects of the plague, created strict systems of internal controls. They closed their gates to outsiders and introduced surveillance measures that would seem unthinkable by today's standards. Citizens were required to report symptoms of the plague in their homes, and some cities even resorted to forcibly removing infected individuals from their homes and placing them in designated quarantine areas. How effective were these quarantine efforts, and how did they shape the future of public health and disease control? While medieval society lacked the scientific understanding necessary to fully control the plague, their experiments with isolation and quarantine were early attempts to manage contagious diseases. These responses, despite their flaws, laid the groundwork for modern practices in disease management. The plague doctors and their ineffective remedies. As the Black Death continued to ravage Europe, medical practitioners and authorities were faced with an unprecedented crisis. The understanding of disease in the 14th century was rudimentary at best, and with no knowledge of bacteria or viruses, the so-called plague doctors were left to confront a deadly epidemic with a host of ineffective and often bizarre remedies. Plague doctors, easily recognizable by their distinctive long coats, wide-brimmed hats, and masks with beak-like protrusions, became symbols of medieval medical attempts to deal with the disease. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs, spices, and sometimes even vinegar-soaked cloth, based on the widely held belief that the disease was spread by bad air or miasma. This theory, known as the miasma theory of disease, posited that foul-smelling air carried disease-causing particles. To protect themselves from this infected air, doctors would wear the beaked masks, often filling the beaks with a mixture of rose petals, lavender, myrrh, and other strong-smelling herbs believed to purify the air. The doctors' clothing, while designed to keep them safe from the bad air, did little to protect them from the true cause of the disease, Yersinia pestis bacteria, which was spread by flea bites from infected rats. The remedies employed by these doctors were similarly ineffective. The most common treatment for the plague was bloodletting, where doctors would drain blood from the patient in an attempt to restore balance to the body. Bloodletting, a practice believed to correct imbalances in the body's humors, was used to treat almost every ailment, despite its proven inefficacy and potential to weaken the already frail bodies of plague victims. Other common remedies included applying poultices of vinegar and herbs to the skin, massaging the afflicted areas with oils, or using purging methods like vomiting and enemas. Some plague doctors even resorted to extreme measures, such as trying to cure the disease with fire or cauterizing open sores. The notion was that by burning the infected area, the evil humors could be driven out. These treatments, while well-intentioned, only served to increase the suffering of those already stricken with the plague, and in many cases, they likely hastened death rather than offering any relief. Beyond the doctors, various other treatments and superstitions abounded. Some believed that bathing in rosewater or immersing the body in sulfur could rid a person of the plague. Others turned to more spiritual solutions, seeking out relics of saints or attending religious processions in hopes of divine intervention. People were desperate to find something, anything, that might save them from the relentless disease. But perhaps the most striking response to the plague, and one that would have lasting consequences, was the rise of plague doctors as symbols of the failure of the medical profession to protect society. The fact that these doctors were seen as authorities, yet their remedies were so ineffective, highlights the vast gap between medical knowledge and the reality of disease. These doctors became a focal point for public disillusionment, and their failure to halt the spread of the plague helped fuel the growing belief in the inadequacy of the medieval church and state in handling such crises. As time passed and the Black Death gradually subsided, the lingering fear of the plague persisted in the collective memory of European society. The failure of medieval medicine to provide effective treatment underscored a shift in how people viewed health and disease. While there were occasional improvements in medical practices, it would take centuries for the scientific breakthroughs necessary to truly combat diseases like the plague to emerge. Yet the plague doctor's role in history was not without its impact. The very image of the plague doctor became embedded in the cultural psyche, a reminder of how medieval society wrestled with the unknowable forces that led to such devastation. And though their treatments were ineffective, the responses they embodied, quarantine measures, isolation, and even the idea of contagion, would become the foundation of public health practices in future centuries. In many ways, the failure of medieval medicine to stem the tide of the plague marked the beginning of a long period of medical evolution. It was the first of many lessons learned through suffering, and the lessons would eventually give rise to modern scientific approaches to disease and hygiene. The plague doctors, though powerless against the Black Death, stand as a testament to human resilience and the pursuit of knowledge, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As society emerged from the ashes of the Black Death, The lessons learned from the plague would inspire future generations to seek better answers to the questions raised by this catastrophic event. But for the survivors, the memory of those early attempts at medicine would remain as a reminder of the ignorance and desperation that accompanied the darkest days of their history. The economic destruction of a world in crisis. The fall of trade and rise of local economies. As the Black Death swept across Europe, one of the most significant, yet often overlooked, consequences was the devastating impact it had on the economy. The plague not only killed millions, but also shattered the intricate web of trade and commerce that had been the lifeblood of medieval Europe. In its wake, a new economic landscape began to take shape, one marked by the rise of local economies, labor shortages, and significant shifts in wealth and power. Medieval Europe was a world in which trade and commerce played an essential role in the prosperity of towns and cities. For centuries, merchants, traders, and craftspeople had established a complex system of goods exchange that spanned the continent. From the bustling markets of Italy to the ports of the North Sea, Europe's economies were interconnected through land and sea trade. Goods like spices, silk, wool, and grain flowed between countries, enriching both individuals and nations. However, with the onset of the plague, trade routes came to an abrupt halt. The death toll among merchants, sailors, and workers meant that shipping vessels laden with goods could no longer travel safely between cities. In addition, the fear of contagion led many to abandon port cities, leaving once thriving trade hubs like Venice, Genoa, and London in ruin. Goods piled up in warehouses, unsold, as the demand for luxury items and imported goods fell drastically. The collapse of international trade had a ripple effect that reached the farthest corners of the economy. For the first time in centuries, entire industries ground to a halt. Craftsmanship, which had once been in high demand, came to a standstill as artisans and laborers either died or fled their homes. The wool industry, particularly important in England and Flanders, was severely impacted, as the plague decimated both workers and sheep farmers, leaving the supply chain in disarray. At the same time, the labor shortage caused by the plague presented new challenges and opportunities. With fewer workers available to work the land, those who survived were in a position to demand higher wages. In rural areas, peasants who had once been bound to the land as serfs began to assert their newfound power. They were able to negotiate better terms with landowners, demanding wages in exchange for their labor, or simply walking away from oppressive conditions. In some places, this newfound power shifted the balance of power between the peasantry and the nobility. With labor in short supply, the landowners had little choice but to offer better working conditions and higher wages to retain workers. Some landlords found it more economically viable to let land lie fallow rather than attempt to work it with fewer hands. Others invested in more efficient agricultural techniques, hoping to make up for the loss of workers with greater productivity. However, the economic consequences of the Black Death were not uniformly positive for the working class. The sudden rise in wages and the demand for labor often led to social unrest. In England, for example, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was sparked, in part, by laws that attempted to cap wages and force peasants back into feudal labor agreements. The revolt was a response to the growing frustration among the working class, who had tasted freedom during the pandemic, but were now being forced to return to the rigid social structures of the past. Even as the economy shifted, the plague's long-term effects began to take shape in unexpected ways. The reduction in the labor force caused by the pandemic led to the rise of a more self-sufficient, localized economy. Where once vast trade networks had connected regions, people began to rely more heavily on local production. Markets shifted from global exchanges of goods to more localized commerce. This shift allowed some rural economies to flourish, as surviving farmers and artisans turned inward, relying on their local communities to buy goods and services. In this new economy, the landowning class began to lose some of their former power, as they could no longer rely on the same system of unskilled serf labor that had once supported them. Instead, wealth began to become more decentralized. Merchants, who had once relied on a network of trade routes, found themselves seeking new ways to invest their resources. The rise of new financial practices, such as credit and banking, slowly began to take root in Italy and the Low Countries, signaling the early stirrings of the Renaissance. The transformation of Europe's economic system was profound. The loss of life and the collapse of trade networks exposed the fragility of the medieval economy, but it also opened the door to new opportunities, setting the stage for significant social and economic changes in the centuries to follow. The rise of local economies and the shift in the balance of power between workers and landowners would have a profound impact on the future of Europe, shaping the political and social structures that would eventually lead to the modern world. As Europe began to recover from the Black Death, the once mighty international trading systems were re-established, but they were no longer the same. What lessons could be drawn from the collapse of the old systems, and how would Europe move forward in this new era of economic transformation? The Great Worker Shortage and the rise of wages. In the wake of the Black Death, as the plague's death toll subsided, Europe faced an economic crisis unlike any other. The labor force had been decimated, and what followed was a transformation in the economic structure of society, particularly in rural areas and industries reliant on manual labor. The plague had taken not only a massive toll on human lives, but also had far-reaching consequences for the economy, consequences that would reshape the labor market for centuries to come. Before the plague, Europe's agrarian economy was built on the backs of peasants and serfs who worked the land under the feudal system. Most peasants were tied to their landowners through various obligations, including working the land in exchange for protection. The Black Death, however, wiped out such a significant portion of the population that labor became a scarce commodity. This sudden shortage of workers created an opportunity for those who survived to demand better wages, better working conditions, and greater freedom. The impact of the labor shortage was immediate. Landlords, faced with fields left untended and a rapidly declining workforce, had no choice but to offer higher wages to attract workers. Peasants, who had once been bound to the land by feudal obligations, now found themselves in a stronger bargaining position. For the first time in centuries, many peasants were able to demand payment for their labor instead of working solely for subsistence and protection. The increased wages allowed workers to live more comfortably, and some even began to build a modest degree of wealth. In some regions, this shift in labor relations was transformative. Landlords who once controlled large estates found themselves competing with one another for workers. The scarcity of labor meant that surviving peasants had the option to work for whichever landlord offered the best terms. This led to the disintegration of the rigid feudal system in many areas, as more peasants became free to seek employment wherever they pleased. The effects of this wage increase were not limited to the agricultural sector. Many industries that had relied on manual labor to produce goods saw similar shifts. In cities, workers in industries such as textiles, blacksmithing, and construction began to demand better pay for their work. With fewer craftsmen available to work, the wages for skilled artisans rose, and many workers were able to negotiate better working conditions. However, this newfound freedom and economic power for the laboring class were not without their challenges. The rise in wages and the growing power of workers led to social unrest, as those in the upper classes sought to rein in the growing influence of the labor force. In England, for instance, the government passed laws such as the Statute of Labourers, 1351, which attempted to cap wages and prevent peasants from moving freely between regions in search of higher pay. The law was an attempt to maintain the old feudal order, but it was largely ineffective. The law's enforcement was inconsistent, and the resentment it sparked among the peasants led to revolts, most famously the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The revolt, which was driven by a combination of economic hardship, frustration with the newly imposed laws, and anger over rising taxes, was one of the most significant uprisings of the period. Though the revolt was ultimately crushed, it marked a turning point in the relationship between the peasantry and the nobility. It was clear that the labor force had gained a newfound sense of power and autonomy, and the old feudal structure was no longer as secure as it had been. The rise in wages and the shift in the balance of power between workers and landowners had long-term consequences. While the immediate effects of the plague were devastating, they also led to significant social and economic changes that would pave the way for the breakdown of feudalism. The new economic system that began to emerge, based on wage labor and greater freedom for workers, would eventually give rise to capitalism and fundamentally alter the way Europe's economies operated. But even as wages rose, the effects of the plague were felt unevenly. While some peasants enjoyed a better standard of living, others struggled to recover from the devastation. The increased wages did little to help those who had lost family members, homes, or businesses. Many survivors still faced the psychological toll of the plague, and the economic improvements were not enough to lift everyone out of poverty. Furthermore, the rise in wages and labor power was not enough to resolve the larger structural inequalities that plagued medieval society. As Europe slowly recovered, the labor market began to stabilize. The feudal system was not entirely dismantled, but its rigid structures had been loosened. The Black Death had irrevocably altered the relationship between landowners and laborers, setting the stage for the changes that would come with the rise of early capitalism and the development of the modern labor market. How the plague altered wealth and land ownership. The Black Death, though devastating in its immediate toll, created a new set of economic dynamics that would forever alter the landscape of medieval Europe. As entire populations were wiped out and vast regions were left depopulated, the structures of wealth and land ownership began to change in ways that were unprecedented. The plague didn't just cause a temporary collapse. It prompted the reevaluation of power, property, and labor relationships that would continue to evolve in the centuries following. Before the plague, the feudal system dominated Europe, with wealth and land tightly held in the hands of a small elite. Nobles and the church controlled vast estates, while peasants worked the land under the yoke of feudal obligations. The land was the primary source of wealth, and the more land one owned, the more power and influence one had. The majority of the population, the peasants, had little to no say in how the land was worked or who profited from it. They were bound to the land and had few opportunities to accumulate wealth or change their circumstances. However, as the plague ravaged the population, it decimated not just the peasants, but also the landowners, including nobles, clergy, and merchants. In the wake of such a massive death toll, the surviving aristocracy found themselves in a position where they could no longer rely on the same systems of serfdom and feudal labor to maintain their estates. The loss of so many tenants and workers meant that land could not be farmed efficiently. Fields were left fallow, and many large estates became unmanageable. The effects on wealth and land ownership were immediate. Surviving landowners who had lost much of their labor force had to adapt to the new realities. Without enough workers to tend to their land, they were forced to pay higher wages to the remaining peasants who could now demand more for their labor. Some estates were abandoned altogether, as they were no longer profitable to maintain. In the worst-hit areas, land was left to revert to wilderness, while in others, landowners began to sell off portions of their estates to survive. At the same time, this shift in land ownership had profound consequences for the existing social order. With fewer tenants to work the land, the once great landed families began to lose power. The wealth that had been concentrated in the hands of the aristocracy began to dissipate, and for the first time in centuries, the middle class began to emerge more prominently. As wealth became more fluid and less tied to land, those with capital, merchants, traders, and artisans, found themselves in a stronger economic position. This shift also meant that land could now be purchased or leased more readily. As the aristocracy began to sell off land in an effort to recover financially, it was bought up by a new class of emerging landowners. While many of these new landowners were still noble or wealthy families, others were commoners who had accumulated enough wealth through trade, craftsmanship, or land speculation to buy land. This led to a more fluid system of land ownership, where land was no longer exclusively the domain of the traditional nobility. This redistribution of land and wealth began to break down the rigid class structure that had been in place for centuries. The serfs, now able to demand higher wages and negotiate better terms for their labor, found themselves more independent and more mobile than ever before. With the old feudal system eroding, a new economic structure began to emerge, one that would eventually give rise to the capitalist economies of the modern world. In addition to the redistribution of land, the Black Death also contributed to the rise of the real estate market in Europe. As more land came up for sale and fewer people were available to buy it, there was a greater emphasis on land valuation, contracts, and property rights. The once feudal concept of land as a symbol of static power was being replaced by a more dynamic view of land as a commodity to be bought, sold, and developed. These changes laid the groundwork for the early capitalist structures that would emerge in the Renaissance. But while this transformation in wealth and land ownership allowed for greater economic mobility for some, it did not come without its struggles. For those who had lost everything, homes, family members, and livelihoods, the rise of new economic systems meant that they had little to no resources to take advantage of the changing world. The rise of wages and the growing opportunities for laborers did little to benefit those who had lost everything in the plague. Furthermore, with increasing social mobility, the old aristocracy struggled to retain its traditional dominance over the land and the people. The social and economic changes sparked by the Black Death contributed to the eventual rise of the Renaissance, a period that would see the birth of modern Europe. New ways of thinking about land, wealth, and the role of the individual in the economy were born from the ashes of the old feudal system. Yet, despite the opportunities created for some, the enduring legacy of the Black Death was the inequality that persisted in the face of the New World Order. In the aftermath of the plague, Europe was forever changed. The shift in wealth and land ownership was only one part of a larger transformation. The very nature of labor, land, and the distribution of wealth would be altered forever, and these changes would lay the foundation for the economic systems that shaped the modern world. The religious divide during the plague. Religious leaders' actions and failures. When the Black Death descended upon Europe, religious institutions found themselves at the center of a crisis of faith. In a society where the church was a powerful and trusted authority, people looked to religious leaders for guidance and solace in the face of the overwhelming death toll. The plague, however, brought with it a series of challenges that exposed the limitations and failures of the church in responding to such a cataclysmic event. At the onset of the plague, the church's response was primarily based on the idea that the disease was a divine punishment for human sin. In a world deeply rooted in Christian teachings, this was a familiar explanation for catastrophe. The church encouraged people to repent for their sins, to pray for mercy, and to seek divine intervention. But as the death toll mounted and the plague spread uncontrollably, the promise of divine mercy seemed hollow. The church's reliance on prayer and repentance as a means of averting disaster left many people questioning the very foundations of their faith. For the clergy, the challenge was even greater. Priests, monks, and bishops were among the first to die, often dying in their efforts to care for the sick and administer the last rites to the dying. Yet, even in the face of this crisis, some members of the clergy were unable or unwilling to offer a solution beyond the standard religious practices of the time. Many priests continued to preach that the plague was a divine test, while others tried to explain it through the lens of astrology, superstition, or as the work of the devil. The lack of a coherent, effective response from religious leaders only served to deepen the crisis of faith that many people began to experience. In some areas, the church responded with extreme measures, such as public penance and flagellation. Groups of people known as flagellants would parade through towns, whipping themselves as a form of penance, believing that by inflicting pain upon themselves, they could appease God's wrath. These public displays of self-mortification were intended to demonstrate the people's willingness to suffer for their sins, but they were seen as a misguided and often dangerous attempt to bargain with divine power. The flagellants, however, were not universally accepted by the church. The movement was seen by some church authorities as heretical, and their practices were condemned. Despite this condemnation, the movement spread rapidly through Europe, with thousands of flagellants marching from town to town, attempting to purge the sin from their communities through their acts of self-inflicted violence. While the church officially rejected these practices, it was powerless to stop them as people in despair turned to any means they could find in their search for answers. Meanwhile, in the cities hardest hit by the plague, the church was often overwhelmed. Parishioners died in droves, leaving churches empty and priests struggling to keep up with the number of funerals. With little understanding of the nature of the plague, church leaders focused on spiritual explanations and remedies, which did little to stem the tide of death. The church's failure to protect its followers from the disease, or to provide a scientific or medical explanation, led many to question its authority. In some regions, as the plague persisted, people grew disillusioned with the church. There were reports of mobs attacking and murdering priests, blaming them for not doing enough to help the sick or for failing to prevent the plague. The clergy were often seen as hypocrites, particularly as they themselves were struck down by the disease, suggesting to many that they, too, were vulnerable to the same fate as everyone else. The church's inability to provide meaningful solutions to the plague exposed the deep flaws in the medieval understanding of health and disease. But it also underscored a larger problem: the inability of religious institutions to cope with the realities of life in a world ravaged by such an overwhelming force. The failure of the church to offer more than spiritual comfort in a time of crisis contributed to the growing sense of disillusionment with religious authority, particularly in regions hardest hit by the plague. The plague forced Europe to confront its religious institutions and their role in society. While some turned even more fervently to the church in their desperation, others began to seek answers elsewhere. It was clear that the religious authority that had once been unquestioned was no longer able to answer the pressing questions of life and death in the face of such a catastrophe. The rise of sectarian beliefs amid desperation. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, a spiritual vacuum began to emerge. In the face of the plague's unimaginable destruction, people turned to various forms of religious expression, often abandoning the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church in favor of more radical or heterodox beliefs. This shift was not just an expression of religious frustration. It was a desperate search for meaning in a world turned upside down. Where the church had once been the sole authority in matters of faith and salvation, new ideas and movements began to take root. In the early days of the plague, many communities were gripped by a profound sense of fear and hopelessness. The church, unable to provide answers or prevent the spread of the disease, became the subject of growing criticism. As the death toll mounted and the plague spread further, many people began to question why God had allowed such devastation to occur. The idea that the plague was a divine punishment, while still pervasive, started to lose its grip on some segments of the population. For many, the traditional response offered by the church seemed insufficient to explain or alleviate the suffering they witnessed daily. This frustration with the church's inability to provide solutions led to the rise of new religious movements. Some sought solace in the mystical and apocalyptic, believing that the plague was a sign of the end times. The fear of death, compounded by the chaos and suffering of the plague, led many to look for a more direct and personal connection with God. New sects and movements emerged, often led by charismatic preachers who promised salvation outside the traditional bounds of the church. One such movement was the flagellant movement, which had begun before the plague but gained significant momentum as the Black Death progressed. Flagellants were groups of people who practiced public self-flagellation, believing that by whipping themselves in penance, they could purify their souls and appease God's wrath. The movement spread rapidly across Europe, with large bands of flagellants marching from town to town, publicly punishing themselves in an effort to stop the plague. While some within the church rejected this practice as heretical, others saw it as a genuine attempt at spiritual purification. Despite this, the flagellants' radical practices and rejection of church authority only furthered the divide between them and the traditional religious hierarchy. Alongside these extreme movements, many began to seek more personal forms of spirituality, independent of the church. In the wake of the Black Death, people began to question the need for intercession by priests and bishops to access the divine. The plague, which had claimed the lives of so many of the clergy, left a spiritual void. As the church's role in mediating the relationship between the people and God seemed less certain, individuals started to seek direct communion with God, often through prayer, meditation, and the study of religious texts. One of the most notable sects to emerge during this period was the Lollards, a group that followed the teachings of John Wycliffe, an English theologian. The Lollards rejected many of the Catholic Church's practices, including the veneration of saints and the authority of the Pope. They believed that the Bible should be accessible to all in the vernacular, and that individuals could interpret it for themselves, without the need for church intermediaries. This idea of a more personal, individual relationship with God was revolutionary, and while the Lollards were persecuted by the church, their beliefs laid the groundwork for the later Protestant Reformation. Similarly, in Bohemia, the Hussite movement, named after John Huss, a Czech reformer, gained traction during the 15th century. Huss advocated for the reform of the Catholic Church, emphasizing the need for the Bible to be translated into the vernacular and for communion to be made available to all Christians, not just the clergy. Huss's ideas, though initially seen as radical, resonated with many who were disillusioned with the Church's failure to protect them from the plague and other societal ills. While these movements were still considered heretical by the Catholic Church, they reflected a larger shift in the way people viewed religion and its role in their lives. The Black Death forced many to reconsider the traditional religious structures that had once seemed unshakable. In the face of suffering, many sought alternatives to the explanations and comforts offered by the Church, and in doing so, they paved the way for the religious upheavals that would follow in the centuries to come. The growing divide between the official church and these alternative religious movements would eventually culminate in the Reformation, a century after the Black Death. The dissatisfaction with the church's response to the plague was just one of many factors that contributed to the Reformation's emergence. But even in the immediate aftermath of the plague, it was clear that the event had irrevocably altered the religious landscape of Europe. The seeds of change had been sown, and the religious authority of the church was no longer as unchallenged as it had been before the plague. The impact of the plague on medieval Christianity. The Black Death was not just a catastrophe for Europe's physical and economic structures. It also had a profound and lasting effect on the religious and spiritual fabric of the continent. As the plague decimated entire populations, including many members of the clergy, the church found itself grappling with a crisis of faith. The very foundations of medieval Christianity, its reliance on the authority of the Pope, its hierarchical structure, and its promises of salvation through rituals, were all called into question as the plague exposed the limits of religious power and the impotence of the church in the face of mass death. In the years following the plague, the Catholic Church's authority was severely weakened. not only due to the death of so many clergy members, but also because of its inability to offer tangible solutions to the suffering. Where the church had once held an unchallenged monopoly on spiritual authority, it now faced increasing criticism. The fact that the church, despite its vast resources and influence, was unable to stop the plague or even offer an effective response left many questioning its role in society. This disillusionment was most evident in the shifting attitudes toward religious practices. During the Black Death, many people had turned to the church in desperation, hoping for divine intervention. Yet, as the death toll rose unchecked, it became clear that the church could not deliver the protection or answers that people sought. While the church's official line had been that the plague was God's punishment for sin, the clergy's own widespread mortality, and their inability to offer more than spiritual comfort, deepened the crisis of faith that plagued the masses. At the same time, the increasing number of religious movements, such as the Flagellants, the Lollards, and the Hussites, illustrated a growing desire for a more personal, direct connection with God, bypassing the traditional religious intermediaries. The idea that individuals could have a direct relationship with God without needing the intercession of the church or its clergy became an increasingly popular sentiment. This belief was in direct opposition to the hierarchical structure of the church, which relied on the authority of the pope and clergy to mediate between the faithful and God. The plague also accelerated the decline of religious monasticism. As so many monks and nuns fell victim to the plague, monasteries, often centers of learning, healthcare, and charity, were severely depleted. The loss of these religious communities had a lasting impact on the church's social functions. In many cases, it was left to laypeople to care for the sick and dying, and the church's inability to protect its own members led to growing resentment. This shift would have lasting consequences, paving the way for the secularization of many aspects of European society. Moreover, the religious upheaval caused by the plague's aftermath set the stage for the great schisms that would follow in the coming centuries. The most significant of these would be the Great Schism of the West, 1378–1417, which arose after the death of Pope Gregory XI. With two rival popes, one in Rome and the other in Avignon, claiming papal authority, the already weakened church found itself further divided. The conflict between the papacies was exacerbated by the continuing effects of the Black Death, as people increasingly turned away from traditional religious authority in favor of more radical religious ideas. As Europe moved through the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the spiritual fragmentation caused by the plague's aftermath would culminate in the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. The Reformation, led by figures like Martin Luther and John Calvin, was in part a response to the ongoing dissatisfaction with the Church's response to the Black Death and other crises. Luther's 95 Theses, in particular, criticized the Church's corruption and the practice of indulgences, which many felt were exploitative in the face of widespread suffering. Luther's call for reform was echoed by growing numbers of people who had long been disillusioned with the institutional church's failure to provide answers during the plague. While the Reformation was still decades away, the Black Death had already set in motion a series of events that would reshape Christianity in Europe. The devastation of the plague, combined with the church's inability to offer any meaningful relief or explanation, laid the groundwork for the religious fragmentation that would follow. As the authority of the Catholic Church began to erode, Europe found itself on the brink of a new era of religious and spiritual exploration. The legacy of the Black Death's impact on medieval Christianity is thus both complex and profound. On one hand, it exposed the weaknesses of the Church and contributed to the decline of its unchallenged authority. On the other, it sparked a series of religious and spiritual movements that would eventually lead to the rise of Protestantism and the transformation of Europe's religious landscape. Surviving the plague as a woman. gender roles, and survival in a man's world. When the Black Death struck Europe, it did so indiscriminately, ravaging populations across social classes, regions, and genders. While the disease spared no one, the survivors, especially women, faced unique challenges and opportunities that were shaped by their gender and the social structures of the time. In the aftermath of the plague, women found themselves at the center of a world that had been upended, their roles reshaped by the catastrophic loss of life and the emerging shifts in labor and society. Before the plague, women in medieval Europe were largely relegated to domestic roles. Most women worked on farms, helped in family businesses, or took on roles as homemakers, caregivers, and caretakers. Their lives were often confined to the household, and their economic value was tied to their relationships with fathers, husbands, or other male relatives. The feudal system was built around a patriarchal society where women had little control over their property, labor, or independence. While noblewomen had more influence in matters of inheritance and governance, their power was still largely secondary to that of men. However, with the decimation of the male population during the Black Death, the structure of medieval society was dramatically altered. The loss of so many men, fathers, husbands, sons, and workers, left a void that women, particularly those who survived, were suddenly forced to fill. As entire families were wiped out, women found themselves with more responsibility than ever before. They were tasked not only with caring for the sick and the dying, but also with managing households, businesses, and farms. In some cases, women became the sole breadwinners, stepping into roles previously held by men. The economic upheaval caused by the plague meant that women had to become more independent and assertive. With so many men dying, surviving women had more opportunities to step into roles they would not have had access to before. Women began to take over shops, manage estates, and lead household operations. For those who were widowed, the plague created an opportunity to negotiate their own financial and social autonomy. Widows, in particular, were able to inherit their husband's property, sometimes gaining control over land, money, and business interests that had been previously reserved for men. Despite these opportunities, women still faced significant challenges. For many, the death of male family members meant the loss of their primary economic support. Although some women were able to take control of family businesses, others struggled with the increased responsibilities and economic hardships. Additionally, the rise of wages for workers meant that women had to compete with a shrinking pool of available labor. While some women thrived in this new economy, others were left behind, struggling to survive in a world that was still largely controlled by men. Yet the demographic shift caused by the plague also had longer-term effects on women's status and roles in society. The increased demand for female labor, coupled with the shift in gender dynamics, contributed to a growing recognition of women as economic agents in their own right. The plague, in its own way, created a space for women to step into the public sphere, even if temporarily. Women became more visible as business owners, landholders, and employers, even if their newfound influence was still limited by the deeply ingrained patriarchal structures that defined the medieval world. In some regions, women played a pivotal role in the preservation of agricultural production. With so many male workers dying, women were often left to manage the fields and crops, continuing the agricultural work that was so essential to the survival of communities. While women had always worked the land alongside their male counterparts, the Black Death left them with a larger share of responsibility. Some regions saw women taking control of agricultural land that had previously been managed by male relatives or husbands. This shift not only ensured the survival of communities, but also allowed women to gain a greater foothold in the economic life of rural Europe. But the plague was not just an economic upheaval, it was also a social and emotional trauma. For women who lost their husbands and children, the psychological toll was immense. The grief of losing family members, combined with the pressure of surviving in a new and uncertain world, led to increased mental strain. In many cases, women who had lost everything were forced to become even more resourceful. Widows who had once been dependent on their husbands or fathers had to carve out new lives for themselves, often in environments where social stigma and traditional gender roles made it difficult for them to thrive. Despite the challenges, the survivors, the women who weathered the plague, were part of a historical shift that would eventually lay the groundwork for the greater social and economic changes that would unfold in the coming centuries. Their experiences, though shaped by the brutality of the plague, helped to expand the possibilities for women in medieval society, even if those changes were gradual and uneven. Women taking over the family business. The Black Death, by decimating entire families, left women in positions where they often had to assume roles and responsibilities traditionally held by men. While some women found themselves struggling to survive in a world turned upside down, many others seized the opportunity to take control of family businesses and estates. This shift in roles marked a significant, though temporary, departure from the traditional gender norms of medieval Europe. Before the plague, most women had little direct involvement in economic decision-making, particularly when it came to owning or managing property. Women's economic activities were often tied to their role as daughters or wives. But with the death of husbands, fathers, and brothers, many women were thrust into positions of power and responsibility. They were forced to step into roles as heads of households, managers of property, and keepers of family businesses. One of the most common ways women found themselves in such roles was through inheritance. In medieval Europe, the inheritance laws varied by region, but in many places, widows were entitled to inherit their husband's property. Though women could be denied full control over the land or property in some areas, the Black Death meant that many estates were left without heirs. With the death of male relatives, many women gained full control over land, businesses, and wealth that would have otherwise passed to a male heir. Some women even managed to expand their inheritance, buying up property left vacant by the plague or acquiring land from the families of deceased neighbors. Women in urban areas were particularly affected by the economic collapse of the plague. As men died, many widows inherited not only property but also businesses, such as shops, breweries, and textile production. Women often took the helm of these businesses, learning quickly how to manage operations, hire labor, and maintain production. In some cases, women were able to run businesses successfully, even growing them beyond what their husbands had achieved. This was particularly true in industries such as weaving, brewing, and market trading, where women had already played a role. The independence that women gained from taking over businesses allowed them to earn an income and become more economically autonomous. In cities like London, Florence, and Bruges, widows and single women were able to run successful enterprises and accumulate wealth, gaining a measure of independence that had previously been unavailable to most women. This shift also had a social impact. Women who were able to manage businesses not only secured their own futures, but also began to be seen as capable economic agents, challenging the traditional view of women as dependent on male figures for financial security. However, these changes were not without resistance. The rise in the number of women running businesses and holding property led to tensions, particularly among the male landowners and guilds who felt that women's increasing independence was a threat to the social order. Some guilds had rules restricting the membership of women or limiting their role in certain businesses, but the plague weakened the enforcement of these rules. Women were often forced to fight for their rights to own businesses or join guilds, but in some cases, they succeeded in establishing themselves as legitimate business owners. While many women were able to take over their family businesses, the transition was not always smooth. For women who had little experience in managing the day-to-day operations of a business, the plague left them with an immense challenge. In many cases, Women had to learn how to negotiate with suppliers, manage finances, and supervise workers, tasks that were previously reserved for male heads of households. Some women sought help from male relatives or employees, but others found themselves in situations where they had to make critical decisions on their own, often without any formal training. In rural areas, where women's roles were often more focused on agricultural labor, the Black Death also led to significant shifts. The loss of male workers and landowners meant that women had to take on new responsibilities in managing farms and agricultural production. While women had always contributed to farming, helping with planting, harvesting, and maintaining the household, many women found themselves in charge of entire estates. They had to deal with not only the daily demands of farming, but also with the economic realities of a world in which labor was scarce. Some women worked alongside male laborers to maintain crops, while others became involved in organizing and overseeing agricultural production on larger estates. As women began to take over the family business, they also became more involved in the broader economy. They began to participate in local markets and trade, selling the goods produced on their farms or in their businesses. While the economy was still in recovery, women's growing participation in these economic spheres set the stage for the changes that would unfold in the coming centuries. The rise of women as independent economic agents contributed to the gradual breakdown of the traditional feudal system and the rise of early capitalist structures. Despite the opportunities, the challenges facing women in post-plague Europe were significant. Even as women gained more control over property and business, they still faced societal restrictions that limited their full autonomy. Women, particularly in rural areas, had to navigate legal and cultural barriers to secure their newfound power. Additionally, many women were forced to confront the emotional toll of the plague, losing husbands, children, and loved ones, while also coping with the increased responsibilities placed on them in a shattered world. Post-plague challenges, women left to rebuild. While the Black Death offered some women an unprecedented opportunity to step into roles of economic and social power, the aftermath also presented immense challenges. The transition from a world ruled by men to one where women had more autonomy was not smooth or permanent. As the plague subsided, the changes brought about by the crisis slowly began to face resistance, and the precarious gains women had made often started to erode. For many women, the challenge was not only surviving the physical toll of the plague, but also finding a way to rebuild their lives in a world that had been shattered and reshaped. The most immediate and lasting challenge women faced was the sheer scale of loss. In rural and urban areas alike, many women found themselves widowed or orphaned, with no male relatives left to support or protect them. Women who had inherited businesses or land were often left without the resources or knowledge needed to maintain them, and they found themselves in competition with the growing number of men seeking to reassert control over the social and economic systems that had been disrupted by the plague. Even for those women who had managed to gain control over property or businesses during the plague, the world they had inherited was not a stable one. The economy was still in flux, and labor shortages continued to affect many industries. For women who had taken on the management of farms or family businesses, the pressure to maintain profitability was immense. Many had to resort to hiring workers, often male laborers, who were now more mobile and able to demand higher wages. This created a tense dynamic between women employers and male employees, where women had to navigate the power imbalances that still existed in a male-dominated world. In the legal realm, women continued to face discrimination and restrictions, despite the temporary opportunities they had gained. Even when women had inherited property or businesses, their legal rights were often limited by societal norms and the patriarchal structures that persisted long after the plague had passed. In many regions, widows and women without male relatives were often treated as minors in the eyes of the law, and their right to control property was undermined by male relatives or local authorities. Inheritance laws were still skewed in favor of male heirs, and women's ownership of property was often subject to the approval of male relatives or the state. Moreover, the emotional toll of the plague was particularly severe for women. In addition to the trauma of losing husbands, fathers, and children, many women had to shoulder the emotional burden of rebuilding families and communities that had been decimated. In rural areas, women who had taken on the task of managing farms often found themselves isolated, responsible not only for their own survival, but also for ensuring that the community's needs were met. The psychological strain of caring for the sick, burying the dead, and coping with the sudden and massive loss of life was overwhelming, and the emotional scars lasted long after the plague had passed. Despite these challenges, women's survival of the plague contributed to the slow but steady evolution of their roles in society. As the immediate devastation of the pandemic waned, many women found themselves integrated into a new social and economic order. The rise of towns and cities, the slow recovery of trade, and the increasing independence of the lower classes helped to shift the power dynamics. The Black Death had created a momentary rupture in the old feudal system, and while the church and the state fought to restore the previous order, women's contributions to the economy and their management of property and business helped to shape the social landscape in ways that could not be undone. The legacy of the plague's impact on women's roles was a mixed one. On one hand, it opened the door to new opportunities, greater independence, more control over property, and involvement in economic activity. On the other hand, it revealed the fragility of those opportunities in the face of a larger, patriarchal social structure that was determined to reassert itself. Women had gained ground, but it was often tenuous, and the recovery of the world after the plague did not guarantee that their newfound roles would be preserved in the long term. The Black Death thus forced women to confront not only the immediate challenges of survival, but also the long-term challenges of rebuilding in a world that had lost so much. Their resilience in the face of such overwhelming odds was a testament to their strength, but the lasting impact of the plague on women's roles in society would be an uneven process, marked by both progress and setbacks. Women had survived the plague, but now they faced the difficult task of carving out a new world for themselves in its wake. The plague's psychological toll, the daily fear of infection and the unknown. The Black Death not only left Europe physically shattered, but also left a deep psychological imprint on the survivors. As the plague spread relentlessly, it did so with terrifying speed, claiming victims within days, sometimes hours. For those who managed to avoid infection, the fear of death, and of seeing loved ones succumb to the disease, became a constant, oppressive presence in daily life. In a world already steeped in hardship and superstition, the plague brought a level of psychological anguish that many would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The fear of infection was all-consuming. At the time, people had no understanding of how the disease spread, and thus they were left to confront a terrifying unknown. Was it the air that carried the plague? Could one touch an infected person and become sick? Was it a divine punishment or something worse, a curse cast upon the land? As the disease spread, families were torn apart, not just by death, but by the fear of contagion. People began to isolate themselves from others, sometimes even turning away relatives who were ill for fear of becoming infected. The close-knit communities that had once defined medieval life began to fracture under the strain of the plague's terror. For those who lived in towns and cities, the fear was compounded by overcrowding and the unsanitary conditions in which many people lived. The streets, already full of filth and waste, became breeding grounds for rats and fleas, the primary vectors for the Yersinia pestis bacteria. The sense of constant threat from every passing person, every seemingly harmless cough or fever, contributed to the deep psychological toll the plague exacted on the survivors. While the majority of the population had no understanding of the true cause of the plague, The uncertainty surrounding it made the experience even more excruciating. Each death seemed random and arbitrary, and it was nearly impossible to predict who would survive and who would fall victim to the disease. This unpredictability, combined with the sight of entire families and communities being wiped out, instilled a sense of hopelessness and despair. People were not just afraid of dying, but of losing control over their fate, and they had no way of preparing for the disaster that seemed to strike at random. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was immense. Communities were gripped by a pervasive sense of dread that no amount of prayer or religious fervor could alleviate. For many, their once solid faith in the church was shaken to its core. Religious leaders, though also stricken by the plague, could not offer any answers or solutions that satisfied the masses. The feeling of helplessness intensified the fear that pervaded daily life. People sought any possible explanation for the plague, from divine punishment to the work of witches and demons, and in their search for meaning, they often turned to superstition and violence. In rural areas, where isolation was more common, the fear of infection still ran deep. Villages that were initially untouched by the plague found themselves in constant fear of outsiders bringing the disease with them. Travelers were often turned away from towns and villages, and many survivors went to great lengths to avoid interaction with outsiders. Even when the immediate danger of infection had passed, the emotional scars remained. The constant vigilance, the paranoia, and the absence of loved ones made it difficult for people to regain a sense of normalcy. For women, in particular, the psychological burden was heavy. Many lost husbands, children, or entire families to the plague, and the grief was compounded by the overwhelming responsibility of surviving on their own. Widows and mothers who had already been socially and economically disadvantaged now found themselves in even more precarious positions, often having to navigate a male-dominated world without the protection or support they had once relied upon. The trauma of seeing loved ones die, combined with the physical and emotional exhaustion of managing the aftermath, left many women vulnerable to long-term psychological distress. The trauma of the plague's impact on everyday life continued for generations. Survivors often experienced what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, flashbacks, depression, and a deep sense of loss. The emotional scars of losing so many loved ones, combined with the pervasive fear of future outbreaks, left many survivors grappling with an uncertain future. The Black Death became a defining event in the collective memory of Europe, an event that shaped not only the physical landscape, but also the mental and emotional state of those who lived through it. The trauma of witnessing death everywhere. As the Black Death spread like wildfire across Europe, it left an indelible mark on the collective psyche of the survivors. The sheer scale of death that accompanied the plague was overwhelming. Entire villages, towns, and cities were emptied, leaving behind a haunting landscape of abandoned homes, empty streets, and unburied corpses. People were forced to witness death in every form, whether it was family members, neighbors, or complete strangers. For many, this constant exposure to mortality became a profound trauma, one that shaped not only the present but also the future. One of the most psychologically distressing aspects of the plague was the speed with which it killed. Infected individuals often showed symptoms rapidly, sometimes falling ill and dying within a matter of days, leaving loved ones little time to prepare or process the loss. Survivors were left with an overwhelming sense of powerlessness, unable to prevent the death of those they held dear. The inability to say goodbye, to mourn in the traditional sense, left many with an emotional void that could not be filled. The rush of death, coupled with the unpredictability of who would be next, created a pervasive sense of fear and helplessness that lingered long after the pandemic had passed. For those who witnessed their loved ones die, the trauma was compounded by the inability to offer proper burials. With so many bodies piling up in the streets and mass graves being dug to accommodate the dead, the customary rituals of mourning and honoring the deceased were abandoned. For a society where religious rituals and family ceremonies were deeply ingrained, this loss of ritual meant that survivors were robbed of the opportunity to find closure. The body of a loved one was often discarded with little ceremony, and the absence of the proper rites created an additional layer of grief. The plague's toll on children was especially harrowing. Families were often wiped out in a single wave, leaving young orphans without any surviving relatives. These children were left to fend for themselves in a world that was suddenly full of uncertainty. In some places, orphanages sprang up to care for the most vulnerable, but the trauma of losing parents and siblings, often without any chance of explanation, left a deep emotional scar on many of the survivors. For these children, growing up in a world where death was a constant companion was a psychological burden that would affect their development and worldview. The constant exposure to death led to a deepening sense of mistrust and paranoia. Survivors, haunted by the specter of their own mortality, began to turn on one another. Neighbors who had once been close friends now looked at each other with suspicion, fearing that any sign of illness could be the beginning of the end. The social fabric of Europe, which had once been tightly woven, began to fray as fear of contagion led to isolation. Even within families, there was a sense of distrust, as the possibility of infection lingered in every cough or fever. In urban centers where the plague had struck hardest, the fear of death manifested in a variety of ways. Some residents sought refuge in religious rituals, hoping that prayer, fasting, and penance might shield them from the disease. Others, more desperate, turned to mysticism and superstition, believing that the plague was caused by evil spirits, witchcraft, or even astrological alignments. In a world where nothing seemed certain and everything was in flux, people grasped at whatever explanations they could find, even if those explanations led them into dangerous or unprovable beliefs. Psychologically, the survivors were left in a state of profound uncertainty. They had seen the worst of what humanity could endure: the breakdown of society, the collapse of normal social and familial structures, and the annihilation of entire communities. The trauma of living through such an event, with no guarantees that it would not happen again, left many survivors unable to return to life as they had known it. The collective memory of the plague, of death lurking at every corner, stayed with people for years, even as the physical effects of the pandemic faded. In some cases, the trauma of the Black Death led to significant social and cultural shifts. Art and literature from the post-plague period reflect the dark psychological toll of the epidemic. Depictions of death became more common, with the danse macabre, dance of death, imagery becoming widespread, showing the inevitable nature of death as it claimed both the young and the old, the rich and the poor. This symbolism reflected a shift in European consciousness, where death had become an ever-present reminder of the fragility of life. The psychological toll of the plague also manifested in the social and economic changes that followed. The rise in wages and the decline of feudal labor structures were, in part, a response to the trauma of survival. For the survivors, particularly the laboring classes, the plague represented both an opportunity and a deep existential crisis. Many turned inward, questioning not just the nature of the world around them, but also their place within it. The collective trauma of the Black Death would continue to influence European culture, economics, and religion for generations to come. The lasting mental health effects on survivors. The Black Death, though it physically ravaged Europe, left scars on the survivors that were just as profound, yet often less acknowledged. The trauma of living through such an unparalleled catastrophe didn't dissipate with the plague's eventual retreat. Survivors, particularly those who had lost entire families, were left to cope with the long-term psychological consequences of having witnessed the collapse of their world. The emotional burden of survival was immense. For many, simply surviving was not enough. They were haunted by the constant images of death, the bodies piled up in streets, the mass graves, and the realization that their loved ones had vanished without ceremony or final goodbyes. The absence of the proper mourning rituals and the disruption of the social fabric made it difficult for survivors to process their grief. Without closure, they were left to live with the haunting memories of lost family, friends, and communities. Psychologically, the survivors of the plague experienced what we would now recognize as symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. These included flashbacks, nightmares, and pervasive anxiety. The trauma of the plague often manifested as a fear of death, which did not subside with the end of the pandemic. The survivors lived in a world where death was no longer distant but immediate and indiscriminate. Every cough, every fever, and every health issue triggered a wave of panic and a constant fear of another outbreak. This anxiety was compounded by the social and economic upheavals that followed the plague. As survivors tried to rebuild their lives, they had to confront the loss of not only their loved ones, but also their traditional roles within the family and society. Those who had lost husbands, fathers, and sons were left to navigate a male-dominated world alone. For women, especially widows, the loss of male family members often meant a loss of social protection and security. The resulting stress, combined with the responsibility of caring for children or managing businesses, placed a significant emotional burden on women. The sense of community that had existed before the plague also dissolved. As fear of contagion continued to permeate society, people became more isolated. The once close relationships between neighbors, friends, and extended family members fractured as people withdrew from one another. The psychological effects of this breakdown in social bonds were profound, leaving survivors with a sense of alienation and loneliness. For those who had witnessed the deaths of loved ones, particularly children, the emotional toll was particularly severe. Many mothers lost not only their husbands but also their children, often with no warning. In rural areas, where families relied heavily on one another for survival, the loss of an entire family unit left survivors vulnerable, both emotionally and economically. The grief of losing children or spouses was compounded by the overwhelming sense of powerlessness and guilt, with many survivors blaming themselves for not being able to prevent the deaths. In addition to these emotional and psychological tolls, there were significant social consequences. As communities struggled to rebuild, they found it difficult to come together in the same way they had before. The trauma of the plague left people suspicious of others, even of their neighbors, as fear of contagion continued to shape daily life. People were often reluctant to trust anyone who showed signs of illness, even if they were not sick. This sense of mistrust created an environment of emotional isolation, further deepening the mental health challenges faced by survivors. For those who had been spared but had lost entire families, the emotional burden of survival was often accompanied by survivors' guilt. They were left to ponder why they had survived while others perished, and many found themselves struggling to rebuild lives in a world that no longer felt familiar or safe. The uncertainty of life after the plague left many survivors feeling adrift, unsure of their place in a society that had been so completely and irrevocably changed. The long-term mental health effects of the plague would not fade quickly. Survivors carried the trauma of the pandemic with them for the rest of their lives, and their children, too, would be affected by the psychological legacy of the plague. The fear, anxiety, and emotional scars passed down from the survivors shaped the culture of post-plague Europe, and the societal shift from feudalism to early capitalism was not just an economic one, but a psychological one as well. While modern psychology did not exist at the time, the mental health challenges faced by the survivors of the Black Death are recognized today as part of the broader understanding of trauma. The lasting psychological effects of the plague were far-reaching, impacting not just the individuals who survived, but also their descendants. The emotional trauma of the Black Death became a part of the collective memory of Europe, shaping the way people lived, interacted, and viewed the world for generations to come. The mental health effects of the Black Death were far-reaching and long-lasting, leaving scars that persisted for generations. How can we better understand the psychological impact of global crises today? And what lessons can we learn from how the survivors of the plague navigated their trauma?